Yeah, hi, this is Jonas here from Daniel Accounting. I can see we already have a few logged in. So I will give everybody a little time. The idea today is, of course, for me to try and help everyone with the questions you have related to starting a sole proprietorship. So if you can write your questions to me, would be great. Otherwise, I already have, of course, a few starting questions that we can begin with. So I will be looking at the messages I get from you, and of course I'll just start up here with a few I have already. The first one I have is what the main reason is to choose a sole proprietorship compared to a limited company. And of course there's many reasons to choose a sole proprietorship over a limited, and also vice versa. For some, a limited could be much more interesting than a sole proprietorship. There's mainly two main differences, and they are, of course, the liability. A limited liability company will, in many cases, be preferable if you have any risk in the business you're conducting. It could be risk related to your clients or your suppliers or your employees. If you have a lot of risk, then usually it's a good idea to look at a limited company. A limited company in Denmark is typically an APS, so you might have read about that if you have been Googling. If we look, on the other hand, at a sole proprietorship, then some of the benefits with that is that it's very easy to start. So you can more or less register a sole proprietorship within a day. You don't need an accountant per se to do it. You can simply log into the website called virk.dk. And inside here you can register the sole proprietorship, fairly simple. Another thing that is a big reason for choosing a limited over a sole proprietorship is, of course, the tax. A limited liability company have a much lower tax rate than a sole proprietor. The tax for a limited company is 22%, whereas a sole proprietor is taxed as normal income, typically around 38-40%, depending on how much income there is. There is, however, one option for a sole proprietor where a sole proprietor is able to kind of copy the tax system for the limited. We call that the business tax scheme. You can also read about it on our website. And the business tax scheme is a system where you can keep money on the company bank account and then pay a temporary tax of 22%. In some cases, that kind of like eliminates the need for having a limited company. But again, it depends on your own situation. In relation to how much money that is required to get started when you have a sole proprietorship, then you could say that it's much cheaper than a limited company. With a limited company, if we take an APS as example, you would need to have 40,000 Danish kroner in share capital, whereas a sole proprietor doesn't really need to come with any share capital. You can start basically with 0 kroner on your bank account. So it's a flexible, easy way to get started. There can be situations where a sole proprietorship is so small that you actually don't even need to register like a normal sole proprietorship. There is you can call it like a smaller brother type of company that we call a PMV. And the PMV is actually registered in the same place as the sole proprietorship, so it's also on VDK. And a PMV is relevant for anyone that doesn't expect to exceed 50,000 Danish kroner in revenue during a 12-month period. So if you just want to, let's say, test a business idea you have, then a PMV could be a good place to start. The only thing you should be careful with is that if you, during a 12-month period, exceed the 50,000 Danish kroner in revenue, then it might end up to backfire a little because you would need to settle VAT then for the sales you've had in the past 12 months. So unless you're really not sure, then I would recommend at least to start with a normal sole proprietorship and register for VAT if your product or services, of course, are VAT applicable. Another question I have here is if you're able to register sole proprietorship if you are a non-resident. And in general, you can say that a sole proprietorship can only be registered for a person that resides in Denmark. So you need to have a Danish CPR number. And also you would need, if you register the company yourself, to have a Danish NEM ID. If you're a non-resident, I can see there is a lot of English sounding names here, so I assume that there are a few non-residents among the viewers, then instead you would opt in to make a limited company. A limited company can be incorporated even if you're not a resident, and you can be both the shareholder, the director, and be a non-resident. So that would be your go-to option. In relation to the time required to get started, some of you, I can see, would like to get started very quick. And if you choose a sole proprietorship, as I also mentioned before, it's relatively quick, typically 24 hours, 48 hours, and then you're all set to go. A limited company requires a little more time, often like a week to 2 weeks, depending on the information that you have available and so forth. Another thing that's interesting to consider also is the time that it takes to close a company. And with that, I mean very often when somebody starts a sole proprietorship, it's because they have a good idea. And sometimes it turns out that the idea was maybe not as good as they thought, meaning that they would need at some point to close the company again. You can close a limited company in a duration of 3, 6, 9 months. So it's quite a long time that's required, whereas a sole proprietor can close the company within 24 hours. So again, if you're not like 100% sure what road you want to take, then a sole proprietorship is very flexible. In relation to the cost for accounting, someone asked here, I can see how much it costs for accounting, then it's not that big a difference. You can say that a limited company has more compliance requirements, and also the accounting is slightly more complicated. So you would have to budget with a little more cost, at least for accounting for the limited company. And for a sole proprietorship, it depends on the size. A small sole proprietor with somewhere between 5 to 10 invoices would use like typically an hour per month of accounting. Accountants, they charge different hourly fees. Our hourly fee, for instance, is 500 kroner for a sole proprietor. So you would pay somewhere in the level of 500 kroner per month. I have a question here also from Vadim, I can see here. He asked here, if I decide to keep the funds on the business account and pay 22% business tax, will I need to pay also personal income tax if I later decide to make a private withdrawal? So what this question here relates to is the business tax scheme that I mentioned before. So just very short, the business tax scheme is an opportunity you have to kind of copy the tax system that a limited company uses. And a limited company would pay 22% in tax of the profit, whereas a sole proprietor would pay a normal income tax of the profit unless you opt in to use this business tax scheme. And what the business tax scheme does is that it looks at how much money you keep inside the company. It doesn't have to be on the company business account. It could also be kept in assets. And all the money that you keep inside the company is taxed with a temporary 22% tax. The question here related to, will I need to pay personal income tax when I later withdraw this money? And the answer to that is yes. When you withdraw the money later on, then you will need to pay tax, but not of the full amount. You would pay your normal income tax percentage that you would have in the year that you withdraw the money, but you will also get a discount that corresponds to the business tax you've already paid, which is the 22%. When looking at this, it's very important to also consider why the business tax scheme was made in the first place. And it basically serves two functions. There is one function which is the ability to consolidate faster, meaning that by paying the 22%, you can keep more money inside the company, which of course is nice. Is it always a good idea? Not really. I mean, you can look at today, a lot of the Danish banks, they will actually charge you interest for having money on the bank account. And in that case, it might be a bad idea actually to have money on the bank account. There is another situation where you are in the maximum tax bracket And if you don't really need to spend all the money, then it makes really good sense also to keep the money inside the business, because when you put money inside this business tax scheme, you can actually remove some of the maximum tax that you otherwise would pay. The maximum tax in Denmark is kind of like a tax bracket that you come into in a certain income level, and it adds a 15% tax to your normal tax rate, which is quite significant, of course. So the business tax scheme will allow you to either level out income in between years or simply consolidate depending on the size of your income. So I hope that answered that question. The next one is here a question from Catherine, and she asks here, my husband just started a PMV and he is testing the market. And then it comes here, question is, after the first year period is over and we decide to change it to a sole proprietorship, would we then have to backtrack and pay all the months, so the VAT, for the last year when we were still a PMV? And here you need to look at two different types of VAT, because there is of course the VAT that comes from the purchases you have, and there is the VAT that relates to the revenue. So given that a PMV is not registered for VAT, then you also were not able during these 12 months to claim VAT from your costs. But at the same second that your revenue exceeds the 50,000, you actually will need to backtrack and pay the VAT on the sales you've had, which is usually not very good because your clients already paid for your services, so the VAT will be paid from your profit margin, which of course is not nice after 12 months. So if you from day one find it like realistic that you most likely will end up having a 50,000 Danish kroner revenue, then it makes really good sense just to register a normal sole proprietorship from day one to avoid being in this situation as Catherine describes. I hope that answered this question. The next one is Stefan. He asks here, you mentioned that the PMV has a limit of 50,000 Danish kroner per 12 months. Is there an upper limit to revenue in 12 months period for a sole proprietorship? And the answer to that is no, there's no limit for a sole proprietorship. You can have as high a revenue as you can and want. There is of course a time where you might have to stop and say, my revenue is so high that maybe it's not a good idea anymore to keep it in a sole proprietorship structure, simply because the higher the revenue, then usually you also would have a higher liability as well. So there's not like an amount where I would say that you should ask that question, but if you feel that you know you start to worry a little, for instance, with liability, then start looking at a limited company. The next one here is Alexa that writes here, as a sole proprietorship, is it okay to keep using the private bank account, or do we have to have a separate business bank account? And that, of course, is a classic question. So what you need to look at here is there is two different things. There is, first of all, is it like legal to use the private account? And the reason why many people ask that is that either they would like to avoid paying the fee to the bank for having a business bank account, or simply they cannot get a business bank account. That's the typical two reasons. If we look at whether or not it's possible to use a private bank, then it is. I mean, there is no legislation that prevents you from using your private bank account. But if the bank finds out that you're using your private bank account for receiving, let's say, payments from customers, that's a problem for the bank. And the reason for that is the bank have quite strict anti-money laundering legislation. So they want to be sure that the compliance team that they allocate to your bank accounts is also relevant for like how you use the company bank account or the bank account. And in this case, if they see that a private bank is used for company purposes, then all of a sudden you're not complying with their internal rules. And that's why the bank either will ask you to stop immediately to use the private account for business purposes, or they will simply cancel all your bank accounts. I've seen that many, many times. If the reason, Alexa, why you ask about the private bank account, I don't know if you can maybe add to your comment if that's because you have been declined getting a business bank account, or just because you maybe would like to save the costs. I assume that's one of the two reasons. If the first is the reason, then you could also go look at one of these fintech solutions, meaning one of these online banking systems. A really good one, and one that's very common used, is Revolut. It's spelled Revolut.com, Revolut. It's a great option as well if you can't get a Danish bank account. The downside having a Revolut account is that after Brexit, then it used to be a United Kingdom company. After Brexit, they moved their European Union activities to Lithuania. And it means that you can get a bank account in Revolut in Danish kroner, and when you have to make a transfer to the account, because this subsidiary is situated in Lithuania, then the IBAN will start with LT. So the only downside is that your clients will have to transfer to a Lithuanian bank account, and maybe not all clients will understand that. Some might even think it looks a little dodgy. But if you have business clients, I would say that almost no business clients would have a problem transferring to a Lithuanian bank account. And it's also perfectly legal. There's no problem with it at all. So that could be an option maybe. Alexa adds here that this was mainly to save the cost for starting the business. And I totally agree. Sometimes it's very expensive to have a business account. Revolut, as I understand it, is a relatively cheap solution. So you might want to consider that as an alternative. We have also on our website, daniaraccounting.com, a blog that describes the Revolut option as well. And also there are a few links to the Danish banks, but if you pick a Danish bank, there is a lot of cost for that, typically 1,000 to 5,000 kroner just to onboard a new client. So it can be quite costly. So that was the comments I had for now here. Another one I had on my mail was in relation to the B tax, like how does it actually work in relation to tax? And in Denmark, the way it's done is that we have something called a self-assessment, which we do in the beginning of a year. So in the beginning of a year, then we would try to self-assess how much profit we expect. And naturally, nobody really knows how much it is. We had the example before here with Catherine, where her husband started a company, and of course, nobody really knows what it will be. So the system in Denmark is based upon you making an estimate, and then based on your estimate, the tax office will then divide the tax payment for the expected profit into 10 different installments. And there is 2 months where you don't pay tax, so that's in June and in December as well. And it doesn't mean that it's like cheaper or you get 2 months of discount. You pay the same tax, just those 2 months you don't have to pay. If you would change the self-assessment in the middle of the year, for instance here in September, then you naturally also would have only 2 months then to settle the tax. In this case it would be October and November. So keep that in mind as well. It's quite common that a sole proprietor would not choose to update the self-assessment simply for the purpose of having more money on the bank account. Of course, if you don't pay tax, then your cash flow naturally will be better. Is it a good idea or not? It depends. I mean, you have to keep in mind that if you need to pay tax after the year has ended, then the tax office will charge you some interest as well. So that should be at least part of your plan if that's what you would like to do. Other than that, I have here how often you have to declare your tax. And for a sole proprietor, the tax is declared once per year, and you will have 6 months to declare the income tax after the year has ended. So that means for a sole proprietor, that would be the 1st of July in the following year after the year has ended. There has been a few postponements due to COVID. For instance, this year we had until the end of August, and also last year it was postponed as well. But the normal deadline would be 6 months. Another question here is also for Alexa here. It says, I have another question regarding taxing rules regarding selling and buying services from non-European Union countries like the US. Anything specific we need to be aware of? Are the rules specific to the type of industry and service? So let's take it from an end. So it's basically two different things here. One is the selling and one is the buying. So if you sell services outside European Union, then in general you can do that without adding any VAT. If you buy services from the US, then usually they also will be exempt from VAT. If we add maybe something here in relation to if it was inside European Union, then be aware that if you sell something to a private person inside European Union, then you would normally need to add Danish VAT. And if you sell something to a company, you would be able to follow the special rules that we call reverse charge. And reverse charge basically means that you can sell it to a company without adding VAT, as long as you note on the sales invoice that you follow the rules for reverse charge. In relation to buying, I already mentioned how it would be from a non-European Union country, from the US. When you would receive an invoice from the US, then most likely it also would be without any VAT. The same thing would go for a European Union country, but again, be aware of these reverse charge rules. If it states on the invoice that the purchase you've done follows the reverse charge rules, it means that if you are not registered for VAT, it would mean that you actually have an obligation then to settle the VAT. And if we go back to Catherine's example, where she mentioned that her husband had a PMV, then he's actually not registered for VAT. So if he would go and order something from another, let's say, European Union country, for instance, where reverse charge was added, he would need to settle the VAT in Denmark instead. Most likely the European Union supplier would not issue the invoice as reverse charge because he's not registered, but that could be a situation where he would see it. So be aware of that at least, that if you're not registered for VAT, you don't get the benefit of doing these reverse charge selling and purchases. I don't see more comments in here, but I have one here also on email, which relates to the VAT, like how often VAT is settled. Some say that they would like to settle the VAT every 6 months from the beginning. It's not really something that you get to decide from the start. It's something that the tax office decides in the beginning. And almost all companies will start off with quarterly VAT. So let's imagine that you started a company here in the third quarter. Then you would have, after September is done, then you would have a little time to finalize everything, and you would need then to declare the VAT 1st of December for everything that related to the third quarter. The fourth quarter, so October, November, December, would be settled next year, 1st of March. So the VAT kind of follows these quarterly terms. In relation to the accounting, also a question here relates to what is like a good system to use for the accounting, and I'm sure that all of you here that is considering to start a sole proprietorship have already looked at different options. So I will mention 3 here. That's like the most common ones. So there is one called Billy, and a competitor to Billy would be a system called Dinero. And then finally there is a system called Economic. And of course it's interesting to understand, like, why would you choose, let's say, Dinero over Billy or Economic over Dinero and Billy. So it mainly comes down to like a personal decision, I would say. Economic is kind of like, we always call it like a real accounting system. Of course, all of them are, and they're all really good systems. But in general, if you want to be sure that your accountant can use the system that you've chosen, then Economic definitely is the go-to option. Dinero, I would say, is the second best option. It's actually the same company that provides these two software. So Economic and Dinero comes both from Visma. And I think the reason why Visma also purchased Dinero was because Economic was kind of like more maybe for bigger companies, you could say. And then Dinero served a really good position in like the small business market. My personal opinion is that Economic is by far the best program today. Dinero does have some good options, and I think Billy also has like a nice, friendly user interface. But when it comes to the actual accounting, I would say that Economic has a much better platform. And also you can be sure that no matter which accountant that you would call, they all know economic. That goes for us and any other accountant. Also one ask here if it's possible to use QuickBooks and other like online programs. And I understand the question because a lot of the clients that comes from like a non-Danish country, they of course use other programs than we do here. Economic, Dinero and Billy for that matter is very Danish. As I recall, Billy does have something also abroad, and Economic also had in the past. But in general, they're like made for the Danish market. The answer to the question whether or not you can use other programs like QuickBooks or Wave or other system is that you can, but they're not Danish programs. So it means that there is a lot of things you need to adapt to Danish legislation, for instance, the VAT. And if that's feasible, I don't really know. I personally would probably not do it. I would go for, like I said, an economic solution or at least a Dinero solution. So that's kind of what I had here on my questions. I have one more I can add here that I got relation to the difference when it comes to being a sole proprietor and being a freelancer. I'm not sure it's relevant in this context here. But at least I can add that that's like a typical thing that it's difficult to figure out when you are a freelancer versus a sole proprietor. In general, you can say that a freelancer doesn't have any ambitions of building a big company with employees and an office and so on, whereas a sole proprietor, at least overall, has an idea of hiring people, getting more clients, and it's not that there is that big a difference from a tax perspective, but still it's something that you would need to consider if you're not what we call like a real sole proprietor, but actually a freelancer. So I hope that was helpful. I don't really have any more questions on my email. I also do not see more questions inside the comments here. So I will give you maybe a minute or something if some of you should sit with a question. Otherwise, I think for today, that's kind of what I had to add at least. What I will do is that I will put on the screen a link here. This link here is straight to my calendar. And if any of you would need some personal assistance from me with your sole proprietorship, then you're always welcome to schedule a free introductory meeting with me. We'd always do it online, either a phone call or we can do it on Microsoft Teams, for instance. And yeah, you can use the link. You're all very welcome to schedule the meeting at your convenience. So I think for now that's everything. At least I didn't get any more comments. So I would like to thank everybody for joining. And like I said, if you have any additional questions, then feel free either to schedule the meeting or send me an email. Thank you everybody for participating. Bye.